Welcome to the EPA Climate Change Conference 2021, Climate Solutions for a Better Tomorrow. We would like to draw your attention to some of the features of this platform. The main navigation is located to the left-hand side of your screen. Here you will find the program, live stream, speaker biographies, attendee profiles, exhibitors, Twitter feed, graphic recordings, how to contact us, and frequently asked questions. The attendee engagement area of the platform is to the right of your screen. Here you can submit questions for our speakers, upvote or like questions that have already been submitted, participate in our polls, submit your event feedback, and make notes on each session and then email them to yourself. The live stream can be enlarged to full screen. You can also click on Show pop-out located on the bottom right-hand side of the screen to continue to view the live screen while exploring the platform. The conference is about to begin. We hope you enjoy.
Good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome to the EPA's Climate Change Conference 2021. My name is Mary Frances Rochford. I'm the EPA Programme Manager for the Climate Change and Circular Economy Programme. We're very glad to have you all here today, and over the course of the next 2 days we will explore how climate neutrality can be achieved through a combination of solutions, including greenhouse gas emission reductions, carbon sequestration, technology and behavioural change. Today we have 3 sessions. Our opening session will include speeches from Laura Burke, Director General of the Environmental Protection Agency, a keynote address by Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications, Eamon Ryan, and contributions from leading experts, Professor Myles Allen of Oxford University and Stephen Treacy, EPA, who will outline the state of play, scale of the challenge, and the urgency of action and the range of solutions to achieving climate neutrality. Later today, in session 2, we will discuss the transition to climate neutrality at the national level within the context of carbon budgets. We will hear from sectoral and academic experts about the challenges facing Ireland and consider the pathways to decarbonising energy, transport and forestry. And in the 3rd session today, we will consider the role of agriculture, land and ecosystem solutions and hear of the key challenges for Ireland in terms of agriculture, land, peatlands and forestry. I will now hand over to Mr. Brian Carroll, Assistant Secretary in the Department of Climate and Communications and Chair for this morning's session. Good morning, Brian.
Thank you very much, Mary Frances. I'd now like to invite Laura Burke, Director General of the EPA, to deliver her welcome address. Hand over to you now, Laura.
Thank you very much, Brian, and good morning, everybody. I am delighted to be speaking here this morning and delighted that we have our climate change conference again this year, albeit virtual. Now, virtual probably isn't the same as being able to get together and to talk about all of the issues in person and have a coffee, etc. However, the great benefit of having a virtual conference is that we can have so many more people attending, and it's great that almost 800 people have registered to be here today. In addition to, I suppose, the huge interest in the climate change topic, which I think is drawing so many people into the conference, also, of course, is the quality of the speakers we have. And we have a great range of national and international speakers, which I'm sure you will all find really, really interesting. And the transition to climate neutrality requires an integrated response, ensuring fairness for all. It must be planned and managed to underpin both systemic change to enable low carbon technologies and practices to flourish, and behavioural change to enable individuals and businesses and communities and everybody to play their part. And as Mary Frances was saying, the theme of this year's conference is an exploration of how climate neutrality can be achieved through a combination of solutions: greenhouse gas emission reductions, carbon sequestration, technologies, and climate communications and behavioural change. The focus for today will be on the scale and urgency of the challenge and the solutions available in the transport, energy, built environment and land management sectors. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at exploring the role of people and society in the transition to a climate neutral economy. And over the course of the next 2 days, we'll hear about how Ireland is responding and will respond to climate change. However, of course, this is not the only environmental challenge we face that requires systemic and transformative change. In 2020, the EPA published our State of the Environment report, and that found that overall, the quality of Ireland's environment is not what it should be, and the outlook is not optimistic unless we accelerate action. The report identified the need for national and sectoral action and the full and early implementation of plans and programmes. It highlighted also the need for an overarching national environmental policy position that integrates and drives action across multiple strategies, plans and programmes. And what really this is doing is recognising that environmental issues and challenges such as climate change, water, air, biodiversity, we cannot look at each of them in isolation. They are all complex, interconnected, and therefore need to be tackled in an integrated way. And the absence of an overarching national environmental policy position is negatively affecting integration and progress across multiple environmental related strategies, plans and programmes. So although we have plans for individual environmental topics, whether that be water or climate or air, ultimately, what we're seeing is the sum of the parts do not make a coherent whole. An overarching policy position for Ireland should articulate our ambition to protect Ireland's environment in the short, medium and long term, and our commitment to live up to our image of a clean, green island. And this week, yesterday, in fact, many of you will have seen that we published our greenhouse gas projections for the period 2020 to 2040. And my colleague, Stephen Treacy, is going to talk more about these later on this morning. But ultimately, what these projections are showing is that Ireland won't meet our 2013 to 2020 EU commitments for greenhouse gas emission reductions. However, Ireland can meet our 2021 to 2030 commitments if all existing plans and policies are fully implemented and deliver as anticipated. The projections indicate that under the best case scenario, with the full range of measures as set out under the 2019 Climate Action Plan fully implemented, that Ireland's 2030 emissions will be 24% lower than those in 2018. Full implementation of all current policies and plans by all sectors would reduce Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions by just approximately 2% per annum, which is the minimum needed to meet our current EU commitments. And I think we need to remember that that's only 9 years away, so time is short. The challenge to deliver on policies and measures already committed to and included in the projections should not be underestimated. And for example, this includes 1 million electric vehicles on our roads, 600,000 heat pumps in Ireland, in homes across Ireland, 500,000 homes retrofitted, 70% of our electricity generated by renewables. And this is just a selection of the actions required. In 2020, and to some extent in 2021, we have seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions due to the dramatic decline in transport and economic activity. These are estimated to be approximately 4.5% for 2020 based on latest EPA data. To avoid a surge in emissions as the economy recovers, as a minimum, the full range of actions already committed to must be implemented without delay. For Ireland to meet more ambitious targets as presented in the European Climate Law and in Ireland's Climate Bill, there needs to be a significant and immediate increase in the scale and pace of greenhouse gas emission reductions. To achieve a 51% reduction by 2030, will require significant new measures, not only to be identified, but ultimately to be implemented across all sectors. And as Ireland emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to look to stimulate economic recovery that is green. So applying a green investment approach. And this will mean that we will avoid lock-in, we will, or a return to carbon intensive consumption and unsustainable production patterns. And I think we need to remember in all of this that a clean, healthy environment offers many opportunities and economic dividends that will assist resilience and support recovery ultimately. The transformation that is required to meet these targets extends across all of the economy and across all sectors, and of course is unprecedented in the history of the state. But as a prosperous country with significant capital, innovation and technological resources, Ireland is well placed to address the transformation required. Advances have already been made in some sectors, such as the penetration of renewables in power generation. We now need further investment in energy transformation, industrial modernisation, circular economy, clean mobility, green infrastructure, and bioeconomy. And all of these will create new, local, high-quality employment opportunities. And Ireland really needs to be in a position to capitalise on these. Nevertheless, making the transformation towards a climate neutral economy and climate neutrality by 2050 is not just about technology and jobs. A number of sectors, businesses and individuals will find the transition challenging. Therefore, in ensuring a deep decarbonisation process, this will have to be managed well and ensure a fair and socially acceptable transition for all in the spirit of inclusivity and solidarity. The challenge is particularly evident in current discourse around the role of agriculture and land use in Ireland's climate response. It is clear that Ireland cannot achieve its climate ambitions without the agriculture sector delivering its contribution. However, what we are seeing is growing polarisation of views about Ireland's agriculture and land management future. Ireland's land and agriculture sector has long been seen as a valuable national asset to provide a secure food supply, an economic resource that supports rural communities and national economic growth. As a nation, we have a clear cultural, social and economic interdependency on agriculture and land that for many is part of our national identity. We came late by international comparison to urbanisation, and on an individual level, there are few of us attending today without some family connection to a farm. So therefore, it's important to recognise and support Ireland's rural communities who make up a significant proportion of Ireland's population, to positively engage with climate action. And many of these people will be called upon to make personal changes and investments to implement change within their family farm enterprises. Agriculture's dominant role within our economy, as reflected in Ireland's emissions profile, is in contrast to our European peers and is reflected both in our current and future emissions profile. That said, the EPA has been very clear on our message for some time now. The data shows that policy-driven economic growth in the sector in recent years is happening at the expense of the environment. This is evidenced by trends in greenhouse gas and air emissions, water quality and biodiversity, all going in the wrong direction. Ireland's reputation as a food producer with a low environmental footprint is at risk of being irreversibly damaged. Business as usual scenarios will not reverse these trends. Developments in farming practices, technologies and efficiencies, which presents opportunities for greater profitability, cannot and need not be a trade-off for the quality of Ireland's environment, either now or into the future. The current model of subsidies or payments to farmers does not adequately support the addressing of environmental issues. And of course, this has also been highlighted at a European level by the recent Court of Auditors report, which highlighted that measures supported by the Common Agricultural Policy have a low climate mitigation potential, and the CAP does not incentivise the use of effective climate-friendly practices. Therefore, it may be appropriate that direct payments be linked to land use and land management activities that focus on co-benefits and ecosystem services, and that encourages increased ambition. This would protect farm income, provide a valuable environmental protection, and also foster appropriate land uses. Actions that can be adopted quickly and effectively must be underpinned by policy, education and awareness, and financial initiatives and incentives that provide the same certainty for farmers as those that supported sectoral expansion in the past. And this, of course, will require the sector to move beyond debate and discussion to commitment and action. Ireland's climate transition is about people, it's about communities, it's about businesses, and it's about regions. Moving towards a climate neutral and resilient economy and society can be successful, but only when the barriers to transition are understood and accompanied by effective communication and engagement across sectors and society. And this will facilitate the demonstration and realisation of the benefits and opportunities for the country as a whole. So finally, I would like to thank you all for attending today and to thank all of our speakers who are committing their time to this event as well. I think you'll find it really interesting and informative, and I would encourage you to actively participate in all of the Q&A sessions as well. So looking forward to an interesting and stimulating 2 days. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Laura. I'd like to welcome the Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications, Eamon Ryan, who will now deliver the opening address. I'll hand over to you now, Minister.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Laura, as well, for your opening speech. We're in an important time and moment as we ramp up and change our ambition on climate change. We will go to the Shannon again on Friday. I'm going to the Shannon Friday for the latter part of the second stage debate on our climate action bill. And we're looking, hopefully expecting that we may be able to get that concluded, that process concluded before the end of the summer break, and that the bill will be enacted to become law in the autumn, in time for us to set up the series of policy stages in place as the Climate Advisory Council sets new 3-5-year budgets for the way we will achieve our net zero target by 2050. The Climate Action Plan, an update of the one from 2019, is drafted or redrafted. And we go through the process of consultation within the Oireachtas and within the public in terms of how we make this step up. At the same time we're doing this, the international arena is the same. The European Union has agreed a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030 and also move as part of the Union to net zero by 2050. And it too will be in this summer starting introducing its legislative package. It's what they call the Fit for 55 package, which will deliver on or set out the mechanisms which we as a union are going to deliver our ambitions. I suppose importantly, what we're seeing from the US is the US government setting very similar targets to the one the Irish administration has set in really ambitious halving of emissions effectively in the next decade. And we will go collectively to Glasgow in November for the 26th meeting of the Conference of Parties of the UN Convention on Climate Change to see can we, to check in, as was required within the Paris Climate Agreement, the 5-year review of our national declared contributions and whether we are on track to meeting the keeping temperatures below 1.5 degree global average increase. And the truth is we're not. The truth is we need to scale up action and ambition in a way that's never been seen before. I believe we can do it. And I believe it can be good for our country and good for our economy, and that we can manage it in a way that delivers a just transition. Without going into all the details, I'm sure the conference today will be very useful in going into some of the sectors where we can have to make the changes. I want to set out maybe just very briefly, just a very broad overview of some of the changes that I think our new climate action plan might inspire and bring. First, in that agricultural sector, and as Laura said, it's going to be a challenge for a sector that has seen growth in emissions in recent years on a policy I suppose, formula, which was supporting the approach that has led to those emissions. That has to change, both in Europe in the Common Agricultural Policy provisions, but also here at home. I believe it is absolutely doable, and doable in a way that actually strengthens the Irish family farms and increases farm incomes, which is the critical metric I think we need in terms of output. What we want to do is bring in a whole new generation of young farmers into managing our land and getting paid well for looking after our natural world. It will, I think, central to this is the commitment to the programme for government for a land use review, and out of that, a new land use plan, which optimises across several different targets. Firstly, in rural development and in getting this new generation of farmers, but also in storing carbon and in paying our farmers for storing carbon in our land. For restoring biodiversity at the same time. We are this year going to COP15 on the Biodiversity Convention, which is just as important and in just as much a crisis as the climate one. So that third metric has to be the restoration of our natural world. Fourthly, a land use plan that sees improvements in the reversal, the loss of pristine water qualities and the restoration of water quality as we make these changes. Also, the reduction in pollutants, like nitrogen, ammonia, phosphate, and other pollutants. It is a multi-layered land use plan we need that optimizes in this protection and restoration of nature and the return of young people to having a viable income on our family farms. It will provide a whole range of different solutions, ranging from the re-wetting bogs, which we've started supporting in Pordenone and other areas. It will involve a lot of, I think, changing in how we manage our grasslands towards the use of mixed swards and using clover as well in such swards, which will allow us to stop the use of nitrogen-based fertilizers and actually have a healthier outcome for animals and a more secure, climate resilient form of agriculture, which will cope with the changing conditions we can expect in very different parts of the country. I won't go into all the details, but it has been probably the most challenging one politically, because the message has always been farmers versus the environment, environmentalists versus the farmer. That, more than anything else, has to change. This will work. The scale of change we will need to achieve will only work if there's a sense that every person is involved, that we're asking for help rather than telling people what to do, that every place matters, and that the importance of place, the importance of connection to nature for all of us in all our local environments is what will inspire and drive us to do this. Climate, our farming and agriculture and land use won't have the same level of targets as other sectors. It's clear that likes of energy, particularly where we've got an immediate competitive advantage in developing renewable power, will achieve a much faster, larger reduction. But agriculture will be similarly playing its part. We will very much have to manage, I suppose, how its contribution on the basis of international standards around land use. And that's something that myself and Brian and others are very closely involved in working now at a UN level to try and get the right standards that support climate action and also protect biodiversity and family farming. And I think in that way we will achieve our targets. Second area, transport, accounts for about 20% of our emissions compared to agriculture, about 35%. It actually may be more challenging. I'm very fortunate to cover both departments of transport as well as environment, climate and communications. In both, we're dealing with long settled patterns of daily life. Our transport patterns are ingrained from decades of planning decisions and investment decisions around housing that shape the transport system. So it's going to be difficult. It will take time. It's not easy to change some of our everyday habits that we have become used to. There are three main ways that it will work in transport. The first will be in switching to new and alternative fuels. And I think what everyone has been saying, the electric vehicle targets contained already in the existing 2019 Climate Action Plan are too ambitious, are too unrealistic. I actually think they're going to be achieved. The reality is, once you get a better system, and the change we have to make has to be towards better systems, as Bill Gates had said, people overestimate what change you can effect in a year, but underestimate the change that can come in a decade. And with electric vehicles, we're already seeing the sales volumes compared to other combustion engine cars really take off. And by the latest, the middle part of this decade, we can now expect that the actual overall purchase cost, measuring fuel over subsequent years, to between electric vehicles and the combustion alternatives, the electric vehicle is going to be cheaper, better cars, fuel price a fraction of what it is for diesel or petrol. Maintenance costs similarly, fraction, quieter, cleaner, quicker, just better cars. So I think we will make that switch. We will also, in the area of fuel substitution or blending in of biodiesel and bioethanol, that'll also be part of the switch. We have to be careful with that. We have to make absolutely certain that the land use effects of it is not destroying our ambitions on biodiversity restoration, but that too will play a part. But a switch in fuels on its own is not going to be enough. I think there will be a significant additional change in the new Climate Action Plan, will be in a shift as well, a modal shift towards more active travel, more public transport, and away from dependence on individual car use, no matter what type of engine the car has been driven by. And I think the significant factors in that, in our programme for government, the 20% funding for active travel, the 2-to-1 ratio of public transport versus roads will help. But also, at the same time we're developing our Climate Action Plan, we will be reviewing the National Development Plan and reviewing it to look at some of the cost increases that are coming in construction, but also reviewing it to say we now have more ambitious climate action targets that require us to develop this modal shift. Third change, and perhaps the most important one though, is that we're also going to reduce the volume of traffic and travel. I think coming out of COVID, there's a strange sense of connection, I think, has developed with the local environment, and people actually having a sense that what they want is this 15-minute city, 15-minute town, services close by, appreciation of local environment and the beauty of it, and a willingness, our desire to protect that. And I think all those factors, the remote working and how that might reduce the volume of traffic that we have to do, gives us the potential not just to switch fuels, not just to shift modes, but to actually reduce, and in that way help meet our targets. I'm very conscious of time, Brian, and I realize I'm only probably halfway through these huge areas. I'll be very brief. In energy, as I said, it's a combination of switching to renewables where we have comparative advantage, particularly its scale in the potential development of offshore wind. We have to be careful with that in terms of getting the planning right. There are 3 significant pieces of legislation. The government, anyone asking the government what's the legislative priorities for the last year, the answer has been the same. The Climate Bill, the Land Development Agency Bill, and the Maritime Area Planning Bill. Climate Bill will be passed in the coming weeks, as was the Land Development Agency Bill, and the Maritime Area Planning Bill is going to be introduced in the Dáil in the very near future. And will have to be in place for us to start the planning, particularly of offshore wind energy, in a timely manner. We go to start our auction process next year, and in advance of that, we have to give real clarity and certainty around how we optimize again offshore the same way we're doing onshore for biodiversity protection as well as renewable development. I believe we can do this. I believe it's probably one of the most significant economic investments the state will ever make at scale of ambition, like 35 gigawatts of power, which is some 7 times our current average use, is beyond compare. It gives us real economic opportunities, and in my mind, energy and security into the future, particularly if we get the balancing right and get the use of storage fuels like hydrogen and ammonia to complement that offshore wind. It gives us a path forward, which I think everyone recognises now is going to be the better economic path. On its own, it's not going to work, though. We have to have efficiency. We have to put efficiency first in our built environment, in our public services, in our every aspect of the economy. And one point on that, and I'm sorry, I could pick so many different areas to work on, but one of the areas where to show the example of efficiency and a new circular economy, what we're doing, is in the area of housing. And we have a huge housing crisis. It's key public priority, housing for all, centre stage. But in that, we need to start thinking about the embodied energy in buildings, changing the materials we put into buildings to store carbon, but also reusing buildings. And so what I'm hoping and pushing for at the moment in government is that this town centres first policy will be backed up by supports for people to refurbish what is it, something like 200,000 vacant buildings across the state. So we bring them back, often buildings with real architectural heritage from 1920s, early 20th century buildings, that it would be much cheaper for us to restore and bring families back into those buildings, much cheaper in terms of carbon content, but also it's part then of delivering that 15-minute town, 15-minute city, that you've got people living back in the centre of villages. And in that, we don't have to build new water connection systems, new schools, new infrastructure ever further outwards. And it's that level of efficiency, that level of circular economy is where we need to go now. Lastly, I'm sorry, Brian, if I'm running over time here, I'll be very brief. In industry, across every different sector of industry, they're going to play the part. They know that. The financial markets are starting to tell people that. You will not be funded. You will not have a viable business model. You will have to account for emissions. You're not going to succeed if you go above if you're not part of this reduction strategy. And I'll give you one example of that gets a lot of heat and a lot of attention rightly at the moment, the role of our data centres in terms of emissions and in our economy. And they do have a critical role, and we do need this industry. It's major part of our economy, but it too has to play its part. And I believe it can. I believe we can combine that, what I mentioned there, that balancing capability, for example, in the use of hydrogen or ammonia from electrolyzers. Well, we will be going to the data centers and say, okay, let's work together to go zero carbon, so that we use that new technology to provide you the backup power you need, as well as renewable power. So we have 100% zero carbon solution. That's where the future economy is going. These challenges now we're setting ourselves with SFI is, I think, one of the ways we can achieve that, to say, okay, let's work together this decade to deliver the future technology that will allow us to meet the challenge in that one sector as in every other sector. And we can make this sustainable. We can make our economy work in a zero carbon, just transition way. Sorry for speaking slightly longer than I should have, Brian, but I look forward to hearing from other people in the rest of the day and working with people as we set into this really important period, going to Glasgow, setting ourselves on the path to halving our emissions in the next decade.
Thank you very much, Minister. And in fact, you finished exactly on time. So you'd be pleased to hear. Before I welcome the next speaker, I'd like to encourage those participating online today to start submitting questions for our speakers via the platform. If you could keep your questions short and concise, it would be helpful. And if you use the @ symbol, you can address your question to a specific speaker, to Myles or to Stephen, who are coming up shortly to speak. You can also upvote questions already submitted. And if you want them to be asked, we'll get through as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, which will be at the end of the next two speakers. So I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Myles Allen. He's leader of Climate Research Programme at the University of Oxford. I'll hand over to Myles now.
Yep, sorry about that. Yep, okay, great. Thank you very much. And very nice to speak to you all today. I'm just going to share with you a few thoughts about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, and in particular focusing on the role of methane, because that's of particular relevance to Ireland. First of all, just the Paris Agreement set out our objective to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. It's worth just reiterating why we're doing this. Every half a degree of warming matters. We've already experienced over a degree of warming, and we're feeling we're experiencing the impacts on extreme weather already. One of the main impacts that we highlighted in the 1.5 degrees report was that even at 1.5 degrees of warming, we expect to lose between 70 and 90% of the world's warm water corals. These are really stark images here of what happens in a coral bleaching event, and you lose that entire ecosystem. At 2 degrees of warming, they're essentially wiped out. So it matters that we stop the warming as soon as possible. And we have to sort of be clear on what that's going to take. And for that, I think we can just use a very simple analogy with the notion of a braking time that I'm sure you all remember from your driving test. If it's 2 seconds before you reach the junction, you've got 4 seconds to stop the car if you hit the brakes immediately. Every second's delay, anyway, you can do all the math. Exactly the same principle applies to the climate. If it's 20 years before you reach 1.5 degrees, then it's 40. You've got 40 years to stop the warming if you want to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, but only if you start reducing the rate of warming now. If you've got 10 years before you reach 1.5 degrees, you've got 20 years to stop warming, to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So every year's delay loses you 2 years of time to get the warming to stop the warming. So what sets the rate of warming? What is it that we need to do to stop the world from warming? Well, the 1.5 degrees report was pretty clear on this as well. If we want to halt the global warming, we need sustained net zero emissions of anthropogenic emissions, human-induced emissions of carbon dioxide, and we need declining, and this is where we slip into IPCC jargon a bit, net non-CO2 radiative forcing. That's what's required to halt anthropogenic global warming. Now, the net non-CO2 radiative forcing means the overall impact, the net impact on the energy imbalance between the energy coming into the planet from the sun and the energy going back out into space caused by other human drivers of climate change. So you could probably simplify this statement to say we want net zero global anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions and no further warming from the combined effect of other human influences on climate. That's a good way of summing up this IPCC statement. And we also said in the 1.5 degrees report what would determine where we end up. The maximum temperature we reach is determined by the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere between now and then, and the level of this radiative forcing due to all the other pollutants in the decades prior to the time of peak warming. So what does this mean? What does this mean for our understanding of the warming due to the main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide? And I'm going to take you through some simple facts here, and I'm hoping that EPA will share my slides afterwards, because this is well-established science of how methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide work. But we need these facts to be in the front of our minds in deciding what we're going to do about them. First of all, every ton of carbon dioxide that we dump in the atmosphere drives up global temperatures by about just under 0.5 trillionth of a degree. Now, that doesn't sound very much. Trillionth seems like a very small number, but we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an extraordinary rate. So 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year is driving up global temperatures by almost 0.2 of a degree per decade. Nitrous oxide is pretty straightforward. It has much the same warming impact as CO2, but much more powerful. So 1 ton of nitrous oxide has the same warming impact as 265 tons of carbon dioxide. Methane, if it's a steady source of methane, then it has the same warming impact as 8 tons per year of steady carbon dioxide emissions. So if you hold your methane emissions constant, then that constant stream of methane has the same warming impact as 8 tons per year of carbon dioxide. That's, again, a pretty well-established result. But what's interesting is that any increase in methane emissions, and it's worth noting that methane emissions from Ireland have been going up over the past few years, any permanent increase in methane emissions has the same warming impact as a dramatic 2,400 tons of CO2, or perhaps better put, 120 tons of CO2 spread out over the following 20 years. So the power of an increase in methane emissions should not be underestimated, but there's good news for farmers in this, in that that danger is also an opportunity, because any permanent decrease in methane emissions actually has the same warming impact as a one-off removal, or perhaps I should say a cooling impact, as a one-off removal of 2,400 tons of CO2. So if you can manage to reduce methane emissions by simple sum, 0.33% per year, or 3% per decade, that has the same impact as net zero carbon dioxide emissions. So this allows us to say what it'll take to halt greenhouse gas induced warming by 2050 from global emissions. First of all, we need carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions to get to net zero, and we need to get methane emissions declining by 3% per decade. And so the left-hand panel here shows the annual emissions up to 2018, and then a sort of stylized decline from then on. And you'll see on the right, that's just like the position of your car. When you hit the accelerator, you come to a stop. And you can see the warming comes to a gentle stop by 2050 if we adopt this, if we were to adopt this radical decline in our CO2, much more. I've assumed, by the way, just for the sake of demonstration, no further increase in nitrous oxide emissions globally, but no decrease either, because nitrous oxide is so heavily tied in with our food production, and that gentle decline of methane that's required to achieve no further methane-induced warming. Exactly the same logic applies to Ireland. So this is Ireland's emissions, peaked around 2000 or so, have declined a bit, but have since been going up again slightly. You'll notice in particular, there's an increase recently in methane emissions. But if Ireland were to reduce carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions to net zero by 2050 and get methane onto a gradual decline, 3% per decade, then you would stop global warming by 2050, which sounds like a good result. But let's look at the right-hand scale before you get too smug about this result. The right-hand scale over here shows Ireland's contributions to warming normalized by the world's population. So adjusted for the ratio of the population of Ireland to the population of the world. So if you like, this is the scale of the warming the world would have experienced if it was populated by 8 billion representative Irish people. Arthur Guinness's dream, if you like. And as you can see, Ireland, you know, as a fraction of the world's population, has already caused over almost 3 degrees of warming. So you could argue that you've got a responsibility to do more than just stop warming by 2050. Perhaps you should take more efforts than that, and it's great. And I hope the minister's listening. I can congratulate you on your ambition in doing more than simply stopping causing global warming when the rest of the world has to. So getting ahead of the game. And one of the most powerful levers you have is, of course, reducing methane emissions faster because of that enormous leverage effect of methane reductions that is, you know, just a permanent 1 ton per year reduction in methane is worth a whole lot of CO2, avoided CO2. So if, for example, you went for a 50% cut in methane emissions by 2050, So that would be over 20% per decade reduction in methane. That would actually quite dramatically reduce your the warming. It would your total warming. It would bring forward the date at which Ireland stops causing global warming altogether to the 2040s, and it would be, interestingly, it would take an awful lot of extra carbon dioxide reductions to have the same impact. Reductions in methane are so powerful, you would actually need to advance the date of net zero carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions by 15 years to have the same impact. So that just that 6 million tons per year of methane reduction in 2050 is worth more than 300 million tons of carbon dioxide avoided. And worryingly, in our standard accounting systems, we sort of pretend methane is equivalent to CO2 using something called the global warming potential, 100-year global warming potential to make the equation. It actually understates the impact of these reductions by a factor of greater than 2. And this undervaluation matters because, if farmers were to fail to reduce methane emissions, in fact, if you were to go back to allowing methane emissions to increase by 1% per year, as they have been doing in some recent years, that would completely negate the impact of your carbon dioxide reductions. So it's very important that we align incentives with temperature outcomes. Some people say, well, why worry about all this? Why not just read off the reductions you require from those wise modelers at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? And just briefly, I would say you can't do this because the results that come out of these models essentially depend on the assumptions of the modelers. They don't depend on the temperature goal. So this just illustrates the fact that if you compare the 1.5 degree scenarios and the 2 degree scenarios here, you can see that many of them are absolutely identical. So what's predicted by these models for biogenic methane is just what the modelers think is possible. It's not driven by the temperature goal itself. So where do we have to get to on this? We need to frame climate policy in terms of warming outcomes. If you want to sort of sum up my talk, I'd say, well, it's sort of, to quote Bill Clinton, it's global warming, stupid. So we need to make sure that our policy goals are aligned with limiting impact on global temperature. A crop farmer who converts their farm to forestry would contribute to reducing global temperature by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they would normally be rewarded for that. A livestock farmer who reduces global temperatures in the same way by reducing methane emissions would, under sort of conventional sort of input-based accounting at least, not be, even though both farms may have had exactly the same impact on global temperature. So, what I'd urge you to consider is, if we'll remember that we're focusing on a temperature goal. We need to penalize actions that contribute to increasing global temperature, reward actions that reduce it, and ensure those reductions are permanent. So what this boils down to is we need a separate, ambitious, but realistic target for reducing methane emissions, recognizing their very different temperature impacts to CO2 in the global climate system. Just as a final thought, I just want to remind you that, there are parts of North Mayo where, as far as we can tell, farming has been going on for over 5,000 years. This is the Cheddar Fields under a pretty typical Mayo sky. And it's great there's a debate taking off about the obligations of the agricultural sector to address global warming. That's a very good thing because we need farmers' help to meet our climate goals. But you shouldn't be confused by thinking that this debate is about the science. Actually, at a recent meeting convened by your Climate Change Advisory Council, there was complete agreement on the science. The debate is about the responsibilities of farmers. And to my mind, it's unquestionable that a farmer who's just cleared a tract of Amazonia to cultivate beef for McDonald's, they've got a responsibility for the vast amount of warming they've just caused. And indeed, we need to be careful that we don't inadvertently encourage deforestation in other parts of the world through our own climate policies in Ireland or in Europe. But the responsibilities of Irish farmers it's harder to pin down if you say how much warming is a farm causing in North Mayo. you've got to answer the question, well, what's the alternative to that farm? Do we go back, 2,000 years to peat bog? Do we go back 6,000 years to forest? It becomes a bit of a philosophical question. What we can answer unambiguously is what the implications are of different decisions going forward. And if a farmer decides to reduce their herd, they will have exactly the same impact on global temperature as if they decide to plant a forest. And I believe they should be rewarded accordingly, and that transparency and focus on temperature outcomes would transform the debate around the role of agriculture in climate policy. Thank you very much for listening.
Apologies, everyone. Thank you very much, Myles. I would like to ask people to keep submitting questions, but to remind them that on the panel will be Myles and Stephen. Laura Burke, or the Minister, will not be on the panel for the Q&A after Stephen speaks. So Stephen, I'll hand over to him now. He's Senior Manager for Emissions Statistics in the EPA. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'm just going to run through now I put up the latest greenhouse gas emissions projections. So this is really just to get back to the brass tacks, as it were, in relation to the emissions in Ireland over the last projected for the next 10 years. This is the latest round of projections that was launched yesterday, and as Laura has already indicated at the start, we have some key findings, and first of which is that Ireland will not meet its 2013 to 2020 EU target, which is something we had communicated has been very likely for the last number of years in projections. However, in relation to the current EU targets for the 21 to 2030 period from Europe, Ireland can, if all current plans and policies are fully implemented, as Laura indicated, we can meet those targets. But really, the challenge for the new targets that are currently before the Oireachtas, as Mr. Ryan spoke about earlier, are much greater, and significant new measures will need to be identified and implemented across all sectors to meet those targets. Just to get into a little bit about what the EPA does in climate science. So this report that we went out yesterday is the output from the emission statistics team, produced the greenhouse gas inventories and projections. But the EPA has a large number of roles in the climate area, and some of the others include the climate research, emissions trading, and climate dialogue, who are hosting this event today. And while the EPA has the lead statutory authority for projections, compilation and estimation, we work in cooperation with other agencies and bodies, providing the essential data that we use and the modelling that's used to underpin the numbers. So the main actors here are, in particular, Teagasc, SEI and ESRI are contributing to the production of the projections you see before you. So just getting back to the numbers we published yesterday and digging a little deeper, we can see that we're estimated to have exceeded the 2013 to 2020 target by about 12 million tonnes, which is a similar amount to annual transport emissions, Ireland's annual transport emissions. So despite the impact of COVID in bringing emissions down in 2020, it wasn't really that close, and we had been projecting that it was quite unlikely for a number of years. I think 2015 was the last year where we projected we could comply with the measures that had been identified at that point, but economic growth since then and also the slowness of some of the measures coming into play meant that the target has been missed by quite a wide margin. In relation to COVID, the response and the lockdown measures is estimated to have led to a 14% reduction in transport emissions in 2020, with overall emissions down about 4.4%. And that's because whilst transport emissions went down, residential emissions went up as people were working from home and heating their homes. So they've done, on balance, some sectors are affected more than others. The reduction in 2030 that we're projecting, which is 24% on 2018 levels, that can enable meeting the 2030 EU targets, but also if the available flexibilities are used under the effort sharing regulation. So just looking at the total emissions we're projecting. So we've got two scenarios, as many of you are familiar with existing measures scenario and with additional measures scenario. And just really in simple terms, what's in these slides. Effectively, the additional measures scenario includes the climate action plan, whereas the existing measures scenario includes everything before the climate action plan. And that's probably the simplest way to compare them. Before the climate action plan does include things like the 2018 National Development Plan. So there are a lot of measures in there. It's not by any means a without measure scenario. Implementation of the WEM scenario over and above the WEM scenario, I feel like, is expected to save, projected to save 58 million tonnes over a 21 to 30 period. So that's the kind of gap between the two lines there. And that is a reduction of 1.8% per annum from 2021 to 2030, a 24% reduction on 2018 levels, and about a 16% reduction on the 2020 level, which, as you can see, because of COVID, has declined. It's a dip in the curve. In the WEM scenario, the reduction is about a 7% reduction on 2018 levels, and a slight increase of 1.3% on 2020 levels. Looking at the sectoral sources of emissions, it's clear that the three main sectors that are contributing to the emissions are agriculture, transport, and energy industries, which is largely power generation, including a few other bits and pieces, but largely electricity generation. And then after that, we have the residential sector, manufacturing industry, and the commercial and public services sector. So the relative importance of the sectors changes, as you can see in the projection from 2020 to 2030. And that really happens depending on the relative speed and depth of decarbonisation in the different sectors. So you can see that energy and residential shares are projected to decrease, and that's because they're expecting deeper cuts there in a shorter time period, whereas transport and agriculture are expected to increase. So that's where the evolution of the sectoral shares of emissions are projected to evolve. Looking then into the individual sectors a little bit. So for energy industries, we can see that there's significant decarbonisation projected here, particularly in the WAM scenario, and a lot of that is due to the exit of coal and peat from power generation, but also an increase up to 70% renewables in electricity generation by 2030 from around 40% at the moment. So this is a 25% reduction in emissions from this sector over the 2020 to 2030 period. On the agriculture side, we're looking at about an 11% reduction in emissions over the 2020 to 30 period, and that's bringing in 16.5 million tonnes CO2 equivalent of savings identified in the Climate Action Plan 2019, and the uptake of measures as described in Incentivize and in the Chagas MAC curve. So that's the current projection. In relation to the measures themselves, some of them would include low emission slurry spreading, for example, stabilized urea fertilizers, and a number of measures around animal health as well, but don't include measures in relation to land use, which is reported separately. On the transport side, we have a reduction, a very obvious reduction in 2020 and also in 2021, and this is obviously COVID related, so these projections do factor in the impact of COVID in those years, and also a small drag on growth in future years, although it's quite a small one in the estimates, because as of now, the rebound in these projections is expected to be back up to almost pre-COVID growth by 2022. So the Climate Action Plan is requiring 936,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030, and higher biofuel blend rates. So that's what's leading to the 13% drop there from 2020 to 2030 in transport emissions. That's actually over 25% below the 2019 level, which is probably more representative of the uptrend in transport up to the COVID impact. Onto the residential sector, and this is where we've seen the opposite impact of COVID, where we see a 9% increase in 2020 emissions, largely COVID related, and also potentially some amount of stockpiling due to due to the low fuel prices, particularly in the first half of the year, and that's something that we'd expect to see in our inventory report later in the year, where we'll have more information on the relative fuel switching. But that's an impact that could also be in that. Overall, the expectation is for really deep cuts in residential sector emissions, and this is the space heating really for homes, because the electricity being used in homes is not reported in the residential sector. It comes under energy industries. But the key measures here are the retrofitting of 500,000 homes and also the 600,000 heat pumps installation, which is a really important measure too. And commercial and public services sector, very similar types of measures and similar deep cuts. So expansion of energy efficiency and implement installation of heat pumps as well in this sector, in these sectors, in the WAM scenario, which is the blue line. And that's essentially the detail of that is in the climate action plan. And finally, I'll just cover quickly, because I know I'm getting close to the end time-wise, some of the remaining sectors. So manufacturing, combustion, industrial process emissions are projected to increase, and they are to a large extent driven by cement and lime growth, which has been driven by economic growth and construction growth, or projected to be. The waste sector is expected to decline further as landfill decreases further, and F-gas emissions are expected to decline, despite the fact that there's far more heat pumps. They're moving from higher to lower GWP F-gases, ends up with a reduction in emissions overall. So just to move on to the compliance situation in relation to the 2013 to 2020, and first of all, and this is where we see what's happened here is that although we had surpluses in the early years of the scheme, from 2016 onwards, we didn't get anywhere. We progressively got further away from our annual emission allocations. So cumulatively over the course of the scheme, it was clear even from last year that it would take a huge cut in emissions in 2020 to have any hope of bringing the overall level into compliance. And although COVID did reduce emissions, it wasn't on the scale that would have been needed. In relation to the 2021 to 2030 compliance, and three lines here that are most important are the green line, which is the effort sharing regulation targets as set out in legislation. The dotted purple line is if you take those targets and add to it the two flexibilities that are available to us. So one in relation to land use credits and one in relation to effort sharing regulation credits, and they're not a given, particularly the land use one. It does require the identification of actions that will deliver that level of credit. But if they are both fully utilizable, then what we're saying is the additional measure scenario will, and the measures in the climate action plan are achieved, the additional measure scenario will comply with the 2030 targets as they now stand, and including for each of the annual limits. So the red line stays below the dotted purple line for the whole cycle. On a cumulative basis, that looks a bit more like this. So just around 420 million tonnes in the WAM scenario, and that comes just under what we would expect to see with the AEAs, which is the 384 plus the two flexibilities, which are 26.8 for land use and 19 for ETS. So that's just a slight extrapolation from the previous graph. But just to focus quickly before we finish on the planned national targets and what's probably in a lot of people's minds today. So the blue line here is again our WAM scenario, and it's 24% below the 2018 level in 2030. And just drawing on the graph what we have from the climate bill at the moment, which is a 51% below 2018 level, you can see quite clearly the extent of the gap. I'd indicated that the difference between the WEM and WAM was about 58 million tonnes, and the difference between, this is obviously a simplistic linear assumption to 51%, and the actual exactly what that target will look like is yet to be fully spelled out. But on this basis, it's about 100 million tonne gap between the 2018 level. It's between the reduction from the WAM scenario and a reduction that would be in the new national climate objective. So to finish up, Ireland is going to miss the 2013 to 2020 targets, as we've been projecting for some time. We can still meet the existing 2030 target with the climate action plan measures that were announced in 2019, and assuming both flexibilities available are used. But really, the scale and pace of changes to achieve the national climate objective is really difficult to overstate, and it will impact all sectors and all of society in order to meet it. And just for your information, if there's anything more you'd like to get, we have updated our website, and the greenhouse gas emissions area on that gives you all this information in more detail, sector by sector, and with some downloadable tables and graphs. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'd now like to invite Stephen and Myles to join me for a panel discussion and to respond to some of your questions. So the first question for Myles in relation to methane. Why do we need a separate target? And the assertion in the question is, surely an integrated cumulative budget target is better, provided it uses global warming potential as an equivalence metric. And this is better than a separate target, it says, for methane, because it allows more flexible policy trade-offs.
Very good question. I think it's important that your policy goal should target global temperature, and so I think the questioner sort of accepts this. And so, if you're going to set a single cumulative target, it should be to limit Ireland's future contribution to global warming. I think that would be an excellent way to frame policy. But that's very different from the way most people set emission. Most people focus their targets on emissions at the moment. So that would be a big step. It would be ultimately a very sensible step. If we want to stop global warming, we need to know how much different countries are contributing to it, and we need countries to stop causing global warming. It's really that simple. But in the meantime, in order to understand what what your emissions are actually doing to global temperatures, we need to know how much of those emissions are in the short-lived basket, methane, and the long-lived basket, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So the simplest way to do that, step by step, would be to set separate targets informed by the different impacts of these gases on global temperature. So that's my view. Clearly, obviously, it's up to Ireland how you're going to set your targets. But what I can say with confidence is, if you set a single target based on traditional accounting, 100-year global warming potential, neither I nor anyone else will be able to say what the implications of that target are for global temperature. And that seems to me to be unfortunate.
Thanks for that, Myles. A question for Stephen. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021 on emissions, and we saw a fall in emissions. And what can this tell us about future emissions reductions?
Thanks, Brian. I think there's a couple of messages from it, that some are positive and some are more a warning for us, I guess, in a sense. In terms of the positive side, it does show that there are measures such as, increased home working that can effectively reduce transport emissions. So there's a positive message from there. On the other hand, it does warn us that if we are going to increase home working, we also need to at the same time increase the energy efficiency of our homes, so that we don't just increase the emissions somewhere else. So there's a combination, but I think that the bottom line is that that kind of level of national hardship isn't something that can be endured, and it's something that could be used as a mechanism to deliver greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It just really illustrates the need for transformative change and doing things differently, not just cutting things as is what happened during COVID.
No, thanks for that, Stephen. I have 3 questions here now that I'll put out, and that you can decide which ones you respectively want to respond to. The first is, what aspects of climate change do you think should be prioritized or addressed through research? The second relates to the production of electric vehicles. and the significant amount of CO2 emissions associated with that due to batteries. And how are these best handled in terms of recording emissions, and how is this best dealt with? And the third relates to the agricultural sector and any views on how best to incentivize the types of changes we need to see in the agricultural sector and ensure that they happen. So,
do you want it, Myles?
I was going to say, maybe you could take the batteries one first.
Sure,
That's definitely more up your street, or the first one as well.
Yeah. So the battery question, I think. Yeah, I mean, it's important to be aware, I suppose, that there are emissions associated with and negative environmental impacts associated with fossil fuel extraction as well. So it's not just simply some new thing that's bad. But yes, there are significant emissions associated with the extraction and production of the raw materials required to produce batteries. The life cycle analysis is important to make sure that that these are understood and can be reduced at every stage in the life cycle. But from what research I've seen, at least, the evidence is that overall the life cycle is a positive in favour of electric vehicles, assuming reasonable usage levels of the electric vehicles themselves. So I don't want to diminish in any way the challenge in terms of some of the more difficult to extract raw materials and the environmental risks there, and that's something that really does need to be addressed internationally. But yeah, on balance, in terms of emissions, electric vehicles do look like they will be the better option on a global level, not just in the end user in Ireland, where it's our emissions to air at the end of the pipe that count.
Yeah, I mean, on the other two questions, I mean, the question is sort of what's the best thing to focus on in terms of climate indicators. I mean, to my mind, it's undoubtedly peak warming. We need to recognize that whatever temperature we end up at will be experienced for at least a generation of humans. So we can't get temperatures down very fast. We don't even know if we can get temperatures down at all. We need, and most climate impacts, not all, but most, scale pretty well with the change in global temperature. So that's it's a very good thing indeed that the Paris Agreement settled on a global temperature goal. We want to limit the warming. So it's not about emissions, it's not about rates of warming and so on. We've got to limit the warming, and we should stick to that goal and applaud those who agreed the Paris Agreement for choosing that as their overall goal. Remembering they could have done something else. They could just say, well, let's just try and limit the warming by 2050 and not worry about what happens after that. That would have been irresponsible. That's not what they did. On the third one, on sort of how do we incentivize changes for agriculture? Look, I'm a physicist. That's not what I can do. But what I can advise you is, if the goal is to limit warming, then take into account the warming impact of different decisions in the design of your incentives. And that's really all I'm saying. Is let's think about the warming impact of decisions that farmers can make in designing incentives for them to decide between one course of action or another. And perhaps in that rather philosophical final slide, let's not get lost in philosophical discussions about what farmers' responsibilities are historically. I mean, that's not going to be a productive discussion. I'd say let's just focus on going forward, how do we align incentives best with temperature outcomes?
No, thanks for that, Myles, and thanks, Stephen. A question here again, I have a couple for the two of you. You can decide, as I say, how to take them. But the first is, how do you react to the assertion in some quarters, and it's often an excuse for doing nothing, that it doesn't really matter what Ireland does, we're too small, and if China doesn't act, we're all doomed anyway. And a second question relates to surveys show that the Irish public broadly understand the problem and risk of climate change. But how do we make climate action tangible and meaningful for the public, that understanding maybe doesn't translate across into the actions that are needed? And are there examples of success stories in terms of societal engagement that either of you might like to reference?
Yeah, I might leave the historic responsibility question to yourself, or the what about question to yourself, Myles. But yeah, in relation to climate action, I mentioned at the start of my presentation the other activities that the EPA is engaged in, and for example, and the climate dialogue, which is one of the events from which is this particular event, and the series of informative lectures, but also working on the ground with people in around the country in the different regions, and with farmers, say for example in our smart farming program and the ASAP work on the water side. There's a lot of stuff being done on the ground, and I think that's where we do need to do an awful lot more to just show people what can be done and how to contribute to the wider environmental problems, but in particular climate, and solving those problems. I think there is a number of actions that we've identified in our report that are at an individual level, but also it is a combination of public support for the bigger actions that are at a government level. And as Laura's pointed out in her interview yesterday, we need to get the technology right, the policy right, and the public support, and it's all three of those things that we need to have in place to achieve what is a hugely challenging target, as everyone has outlined.
Thanks, Stephen.
Am I right that the responsibility question was sort of looking at responsibility for emissions inside and outside the borders of Ireland? Is that, did I get that right?
I think that the question was largely that Ireland is such a small economy and society, and our emissions relative to global emissions. So why should Ireland do anything? It's China. That's
there's an easy answer to that question, which I think was illustrated by the right-hand scale on those graphs. I mean, if the world were populated by a representative Irish person, we'd already be at 3 degrees. So, I don't think you can argue with that observation, that we can't say just because there's only a few million Irish people that diminishes Ireland's responsibility. I mean, we could all if we all took that line, each of us individually is only 1 in 8 billion. Then you could take that logic to its end conclusion. However, it does illustrate the very important point that other countries have to take action as well, and Ireland can play a crucial catalytic role in helping other countries frame effective climate policies. And this is actually one thing which I would want to stress would be transformative. If Ireland were to step up and start reporting cumulative pollutants like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and short-lived pollutants like methane separately in both your targets and in your nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, then it would immediately, I hope questions would get asked in other countries, for example, my own, where the government is steadfastly refusing to contemplate such a measure. Why aren't we doing the same? Because only if you do that separate reporting can you actually say what your emissions are doing to global temperature. So, Ireland can set examples, can develop technologies, can help the rest of the world reduce emissions. But of course, we're not going to stop global warming until we all do.
Thanks, Myles. A couple of more questions now. The first is around how we frame the objective. And the questioner asks, is there a problem with this transition to climate neutrality framing? The assertion is that neutrality is not enough. We need neutrality consistent with global temperature well below 2 degrees. That is surely a critical distinction that is lost by a sole focus on climate neutrality. And a second question relating to the presentation of the inventories is, how are we going to achieve a 51% reduction in emissions by 2030 if projected decreases of only 11% in agriculture and 14% in transport are there for the period?
Well, I might take that second one first and maybe leave the first one to you, Myles. I think in relation to what we were saying in the projections is that's the projection based on the 2019 Climate Action Plan. We are anticipating, and Brian can talk more about it if he wants, a new update to the action plan this year that will reflect the the more ambitious targets that we're seeing, and that will be where those measures will need to be fleshed out to see how that will be achieved. But there's no understating, as I pointed out, that the scale of the challenge is really huge, and it's effectively a doubling as it stands. Just on the simplistic assumption, it's effectively a doubling of the ambition compared to what was there for the existing 2030 target. So it's by no means an easy task, and as I say, this is something that we're trying to get across, and the need to act now and act deeply, and for all sectors to act, is going to be crucial.
Thanks, Stephen.
On the climate neutrality question, yes, for rich countries, achieving climate neutrality probably isn't enough. I mean, we probably do need to work at undoing some of the historical warming we've caused. And we should be upfront about that, and upfront with people as we propose climate legislation. We should explain to people what it's for. It's not only to stop causing global warming, but it's also to start to undo some of the harm that we've caused in the past. For poor countries, of course, they're in a very different situation. Eventually, they too will have to achieve climate neutrality, because at the end of the day, the world won't stop warming until we all achieve climate neutrality. If by climate neutrality we mean no longer causing global warming, but you can't argue that a poor country that hasn't been responsible for much warming today has the same responsibilities as a wealthy country that has caused a lot of global warming. And of course, I'm speaking to you from the country that started this before anybody else did, and is probably responsible for more warming per head of population than just about any other.
Thanks, Myles. We're coming near the end of the session. Maybe just a couple of more questions. Again, focus on agriculture. As well as reducing methane emissions from livestock, do we also need to encourage people to reduce dairy and beef consumption? Otherwise, the countries buying it from us at present will buy it from other countries, such as Brazil. Should the consumer countries not pay for the emissions in the production country? Otherwise, we are just moving the country producing the methane, and worldwide emissions will stay the same. And that was for Myles. And then one for Stephen. What nature-based solutions would you recommend for addressing emissions aside from forestry, especially for agriculture?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, there's no point in reducing emissions from Irish agriculture if the only impact of that is to increase emissions elsewhere. And therefore, I think there's a very strong case to open a discussion about, if your agricultural sector is not causing global warming anymore, then should you be asking your trading partners whether their agricultural sector is causing global warming? We need the whole world's agricultural sector to stop causing global warming. In fact, we probably needed to go beyond that and help out other sectors to compensate for their warming. But I think that's undoubtedly will be required. And I think that's a conversation that should be happening at the European level about how we're going to deal with trading partners who are still causing global warming if our own farmers are no longer doing so.
Thanks for that, Myles. I don't know, Stephen, it was addressed to you. Did you want to come in on that nature-based solutions? Or?
Yeah, I might come in on it briefly, just because it's not, again, it's a policy question as much as anything, but it is something that Laura touched on, I think, in her talk as well, about that incentives in the agriculture area, are looking at the bringing water quality, air quality, biodiversity, and climate impact back to the right direction, as opposed to facilitating making things worse. So I think it's clear that the current model doesn't adequately support the addressing of environment issues. That's a clear distinction. In terms of the actual solutions, and I think leaving forestry out of it makes it particularly difficult. There are a range of solutions. I mean, forestry to some extent on a farm level, not just that commercial forestry level, is something that is important from a water quality perspective as well, in the right areas. And so there are a range, and tackling measures that will rejuvenate pollinators, I guess, are also something that could be considered. But really, it's a question to be addressed for the agriculture specialists, Brian, and I think there's plenty of them here later on to be able to talk about that.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen. And just as we close out the Q&A session, I might give both of you an opportunity if you want to make some closing remarks. Maybe Myles first and then Stephen.
Well, just to emphasize that I think Ireland has an opportunity to do something really pioneering in your climate change bill and your climate change engagement with COP26. You are a developed country with quite an emissions profile that's actually much more like the world's than most other developed countries who are proposing ambitious climate legislation. So you do have an opportunity to set an example to the world. And while the likes of the UK and Europe have rather regarded methane as this sort of slightly awkward problem to be shunted off in the corner and not to be worried about too much, it's going to be an issue for the rest of the world. If you remember those graphs of global emissions, the world is producing a lot of methane, and we're going to need to do something about that. So Ireland definitely has an opportunity to get this right and really help the rest of the world in the process. And I think the secret to getting it right is to focus on temperature impact in everything we do, because that's what's going to determine the ultimate harm caused by climate change.
Thanks, Myles. Stephen, I don't know, do you want to make any closing remarks?
Yeah, well, just the same as what I had highlighted in the summary. I guess, that the scale and pace of action that's needed by the new ambition is colossal. And I think across all sectors, we're getting to the point where we need to move beyond as Laura said, the debate and discussion phase and moving to commitment and action. It's really about action now, and not forgetting, of course, that the climate transition is about people, communities, businesses, and regions, as Laura also pointed out. It's all about everyone moving together, and really the scale can allow nothing else.
No, thanks, Stephen. Look, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all our speakers this morning and for fascinating contributions. Particularly thank Myles and Stephen for their participation in the Q&A. We're going to take a short break for tea, coffee, and we'll begin again at 10:45. So when you come back, please click on session 2 to rejoin after the break. Also take some time to explore the platform, the resources, attendee profiles, and the graphic recordings. And most importantly of all, enjoy the break. Thanks.